Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this inaugural MiTalks session. As folks continue to come in, we want to welcome you here with us today. Please do enter the chat, share your name, your affiliation, or your organization, and what you're hoping to gain from today's session. Please note that we will have Q&A at the end of our time together today. So feel free to drop questions as they come up, and Lisa will answer them following her presentation. Just so that you are aware, this meeting will be recorded and the webinar will be distributed after this time. So if you have any concerns around that recording, please do let us know. So we are so happy to have you here. We're going to walk you briefly through the agenda. So it won't take us too long to do that. Quite simple. So we will start with introductions and we welcome you. And then I will take some time to review this program, MiVTTP, and the overview and provide some updates on where we are. We'll take time in this presentation, who's driving, industry versus policy in the EV transition. And then we'll have some time for Q&A and next steps as we review what's ahead. So we will take some time for introductions. And as repeated, if you're joining us now, please share your name, your affiliation or organization, and what you're hoping to gain from today's session. And as you do that, I will go ahead and introduce myself and show you some of the great members of this MiVTTP team that are doing hard work on this MiVTTP project, which I'll share a little bit more about quite soon. But I will briefly introduce myself as well. I'll be your facilitator this morning. My name is Latricia Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a project manager with the Economic Growth Institute, or EGI, as we affectionately call it. We work at the University of Michigan and work to leverage the University of Michigan's resources and opportunities in order to best support communities that are navigating economic shifts. And so that's the work that we do on the community side. And I'm really happy to work on this project in particular, MiVTTP, which stands for the Michigan Vehicle Technology Transition Impact Project. And now you see here before us what we call a deep bench of folks on the MiVTTP team, folks from across the Economic Growth Institute and the Michigan Clean Cities and Next Energy Network. This is a partnership between these two organizations. And so it's really been a wonderful opportunity so far since on this project that we've been working together. As you keep making introductions, it's great to get to know each of you in the chat. Please do continue to do that. I will take just a few moments to walk us through MiVTTP and the overview of the program in case you're new. Some of us in the room are MiVTTP community members, and so this will not be new information to you. But for those of us for whom it's your first time learning a little bit about MiVTTP, I'd love to get you on the same page so you can learn about the program. So MiVTTP is a program that's been funded by the Federal Department of Energy, and we seek to support 11 Michigan communities. Those communities are indicated here in this map here, so that includes the city of Detroit, Ecorse, Flint, Hamtramck, Lansing, Lincoln Park, Melvindale, Pontiac, River Rouge, Warren, and Wyandotte. These communities have been identified as folks and spaces that will be most impacted by the EV transition and the shifts in the auto industry. And so MiVTTP exists in 3 phases. We've completed the first phase and we're squarely in the second and third, depending on the communities in which you might find yourself. So we began in 2023 with community listening sessions. We wanted to connect with each member of the community that has some insights around this EV transition to learn about the potential impacts. And so through that, we began to accomplish some of our intended program outcomes to understand the community needs and impacts of the EV transition. We work now in strategic planning for several of our participating communities to provide strategic planning support about these potential impacts and to provide action plans. And over time, we develop in the third phase, workforce training and development solutions and technical assistance. Overall, we hope to support the community responses to unique challenges and opportunities that arise as a part of this auto industry transition. And we love to promote higher job placement in MiVTTP communities, that we could see each community that's been a part of this programming throughout the years to say, yeah, we have seen more sustainable communities developed, more wealth built, more stability attained, and true thriving. We hope to see thriving in these communities. So that's a part of the work that we do. We wanted to get you all aware of MiVTTP. And if you are curious about how we can support you or your communities, whether in MiVTTP or other programming, we are always happy to help. So myself and other members of EGI and Michigan Clean Cities will always be available for questions regarding that. If you're just joining us, please do welcome. Please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat to share your affiliation and what you'd like to learn today. We're so happy to have you here. And we're about to transition now to our presentation. So I'm excited to introduce our speaker to you soon. So we have before us, we're quite lucky to learn today from Dr. Lisa Krusemark. Now, Lisa Krusemark is a research scientist at the Center for Automotive Research, affectionately known in the industry as CAR. In her role at CAR, Lisa conducts research for automotive industry and public sector initiatives, and she concentrates on the impact of these auto technology shifts on both manufacturing and workforce development. So we have much to ask her today and learn from her today. Over the years, Lisa has led national and state level research projects that focus on identifying critical job skills and training needs related to these changing automotive propulsion systems, just like EVs and batteries. So Lisa leads research methods and develops research designs for CAR projects. These include survey and interview engagement. Lisa received her PhD in psychology from the University of Georgia and served as a researcher and assistant professor in psychology and neuroscience. Overall, Lisa has over 18 years of experience in research design, survey and interview methods, human behavioral and psychophysiological research, and quantitative analysis. Enough cannot be said about Lisa and the value she brings to these spaces. We are so happy to have you here today with us this morning for this presentation as we discuss who's driving auto industry versus policy in the EV transition. Lisa, take it away. We will get us going with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Latricia. It's so nice to be here with you and the MiVTTP team. It's very nice to see you all today. So thank you again for your time. I really am excited to join you and share a little bit about the auto industry versus policy, as this title has so named it. So as we get those loaded up, I just wanted to say I'm really excited to share today some data that we have and that we track here at CAR. Much of this has to do with economic indicators within the industry, as well as the policies that we are seeing and how that shapes the industry. The policy of late has really generated a lot of activity across the country right now and across the globe. So for those of you who are not familiar with CAR, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, we're an independent nonprofit research organization focused on the auto industry. While we are located in Michigan, we focus on issues across North America and the US. So I want to show you briefly the three dimensions of our activities at CAR, first of which is the research, and I'm a member of that research team. We conduct work for the auto industry in particular. We focus on providing unbiased, independent research, meaning we don't lobby on behalf of anyone. Our work is really based on the interdisciplinary background of our team. We have an excellent group of economists, scientists who focus on both the macroeconomic trends, labor economics and policy, technology, and energy and sustainability shifts that we see in industry. Another part of our activity relates to our partner program. So we have over 100 organization members in our affiliates and Automotive Communities Partnership Program. This is a group from the community at large, and many of you may be CAR members. We share our research access with you all, and that's designed to be able to convene members as well as bring together folks so that we understand what is most important to the industry at large and the public sector. Really, that drives what we do. The third arm of CAR is focused on our events. So our flagship event is actually coming up. We'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. That's referred to as Management Briefing Seminar, or MBS. We also hold quarterly events and focus on providing these from the research work that we do, as well as convening stakeholders to talk about critical issues facing the industry. So now I'll jump into a little bit of an overview of what I'd like to talk about. We can move to the next slide. So what I'd like to do first is to think about the 11 cities in the MiVTTP program. So As I go through the data, I want to focus on these locations because each of these communities are really seated in an area where they're both a combination of a lot of opportunities and a lot of new growth, as well as all of the challenges that come with these types of transitions. So we want to get that 30,000-foot view of industry signals that we see in the state of Michigan. And I'll present some data that we track from what we call our CAR book of deals. That's really related to automotive investments that are capital investments for new facilities, expansions, retooling, really amongst the automakers and suppliers that give us a sign of where things are going in terms of the direction for industry. And I like to share that first across North America and the US, and then zoom in a little bit more to Michigan and the region. Really, both of these types of signals, so from automakers and suppliers, show how investments really impact both the direction of industry in terms of those strategies and financial decision making, but as well as the jobs that are really tied to that. And that's really key right now to think about as we think about this transition. I'd also like to talk about a little bit of what we observe in terms of vehicle sales, how that breaks down for electric vehicles and all of the different propulsion system types in terms of the diverse opportunities there that are tied to the directions for auto industry. So there are a number of vehicle alternatives that have different shares of the market right now and different trajectories of growth. I'd like to take some time next to review the federal policies that we're seeing currently, impacting auto industry and across the country right now, and talk a little bit more about those implications, what we're seeing within industry in terms of signals of response and impact of that policy. And then finally, think about some of the parallel work that CAR has done that really highlights some of the important factors that we're seeing in communities here in Michigan. One in which we had an opportunity to work with the community last summer, and that connected us with MiVTTP as well, where we're looking at how there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to thinking about an economic transition in communities. We have to think about that as having really unique perspectives, different community needs, and ways of thinking about that transition. So I'll end with that and then hopefully jump into some Q&A. So if we move into the next slide, I want to highlight, many of you know the community area that we're talking about in the MiVTTP program. So as Latricia noted, these 11 areas are extremely important, and we see them in the context right here next to all of the automaker facilities we're talking about in Michigan. So there's a great concentration of those facilities, as we know, in Southeast Michigan, but across the state, we're talking about 120 automotive vehicle and system assembly plants. That also includes R&D facilities, as well as original equipment manufacturer headquarters, so those offices. So that's a great deal of concentration within the state relative to many other states in the Midwest. We consider Michigan that heart of the industry. And just amongst these automaker facilities alone, it's estimated that we have roughly 48,200 employed just by that. And that doesn't include the suppliers that we're talking about, which are estimated to represent about 161,000 of Michiganders employed in the state. So that really is impacting a great deal of our base. And when we look at the location of these communities, we see how they're positioned within the areas of heavy concentration, as well as that extended network throughout the state. So if we move into the next slide, you'll see here, just to zoom in a little bit more into that Detroit metro area, we see exactly how each of these is tied to a location for a large facility. And really that reflects some of the larger employment opportunities, but it isn't limited to that. As we know, that supplier network is vast. And we have a great network of small, medium-sized manufacturers, as well as those larger suppliers and manufacturers within the state. So I'll step into some of these investments next and give you a highlight of what we see in terms of both the automakers and the supplier investments, what it looks like historically, and where things appear to be going. And we can take that into account looking at this timeline of events in terms of capital investments. As I mentioned, we focus a lot on tracking this because this gives us an idea of not only the timeline of investments amongst the automakers that are making large-scale decisions and developing the new vehicles as we see coming out into the market, but also making shifts amongst the existing automotive assembly footprint amongst those different facilities, retooling and shifting into different diversified vehicle models and different programs. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see characteristic of car. We're looking at this from that 30,000-foot view. As I mentioned, this is automaker announced investments. So the way we track this is the publicly announced capital investments in the media. So those are primarily, as I mentioned, new facilities, expansions, retooling, and reinvestments in existing facilities. What you see here on the graph are those investments in US dollars, and we see that uptick that we see peaking in 2023. And this is color-coded based on what these investments are tied to. So for us, we think of the investments for electrification having to do with new vehicle propulsion systems, so that's electric vehicle. It also includes plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, hybrid electric vehicles, and fuel cell electric vehicles, and anything related to those systems or even batteries. So anything electrification related is depicted here in green. So you see that sawtooth pattern that represents the investments that have peaked as a function of a lot of UAW contract negotiation years we see in 2011, 2015, 2019, and 2023. And then you see that uptick and the proportion of those electrification investments. So that's really a sign of the commitment amongst the automakers looking at the proportion of these investments. And when we look at that overall, I believe it's over 85% of these investments from 2020 onwards are tied to electrification. If we go to the next slide, you'll see, and it's over 83% here, yeah, since 2018. So if we look at this distribution across the country, what we see here are the announced automaker investments, again, depicted as a function of each state. We see that some of the, Michigan is typically in the lead or just in the second place in terms of state positioning for the share of those automaker investments. In this case right now, these data reflect first quarter data. So through March of this year, we saw that Georgia is leading the share of this with investments. So they have roughly 18% of automaker investments, which is represented in investments in their large facilities in West Point, the Savannah area, and greater Atlanta areas in the Ford GM plants, as well as a planned Rivian facility. And this pattern of investment has continued to expand from that heart in the Midwest and Michigan, down that I-75 corridor, down to the Southeast and across the US. So Michigan still has a great deal of share in these new automaker investments, but we see this as really broadening across the country. And when we look at the next slide, we see some of these running totals of state automaker investments. If you look at the period on the left, so the pie charts on the left show us that from 2015 to 2019, we saw that the US Great Lakes region was way ahead with roughly 74% of these automaker investments. But as we shift into the period from 2020 forward, we see that many of these new investments in the Southeast, including Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina, they're starting to see a shift in a bigger share of those investments in that region. And so we see that trajectory shown just from that more recent period amongst some of the states in the Midwest and the Southeast, showing that Michigan has continued to go up as all of these investments primarily have gone up over time. Most recently, Georgia had several investments that were happening since 2020 and those happening this year at their Hyundai and Kia plant locations. And so they're making some expansions to their assembly plants. And the states in the South have really been appealing for the fact that they're right to work states. We know that the cost of living is slightly lower, and there are a great number of incentives from the states to bring that investment in manufacturing down to the South. We also see a great deal of that happening in Alabama. They recently had an investment expansion in their Hyundai facility, and that was over $9 billion. So there's some very large scale investments with a B in terms of billions that really are increasing the scale of and the share of those investments in the South, and some of those being tied to battery plants as well. And so those are not small investments. If we move into the next slide, I wanted to point out the pattern of investment amongst automakers in Michigan. So we see a very similar pattern of investments that tend to track with this UAW contract negotiation years, as I mentioned before. We also see that increase in electrification related investment that starts to begin around 2018, 2019. There are multiple large investments that are happening in Michigan that are driving a lot of that. And we see that, again, very high proportion of the investments of late are tied to electrification. So that really is a signal of that transition happening. We know that there are a great number of assembly plants that are getting retooled. So shifting over from traditional ICE manufacturing, retooling and expanding the offerings, either adding a new vehicle program or completely converting over to either a hybrid electric or EV offering. So we know that we see retooling, for example, that was happening back when it was Fiat Chrysler at the Jefferson Assembly Plant in Detroit. We also know GM was making a great deal of transition in their Hamtramck facility to produce EV trucks. So many of these started to follow around 2021, and that tracks with the timing of the bipartisan infrastructure law, where we started to see more incentives for this EV and battery manufacturing. So that really is when things started to take hold and see a big uptick in terms of those automaker investments. So really, when we think about these investments, we also want to focus on what the opportunities are for jobs in these areas. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the job shift toward electrification too. So this is zoomed back out to North America. These are announced jobs and only new jobs announced. So oftentimes we track both the new jobs that are tied to these investments and the jobs that are considered to be retained. And the reason I don't present the retained jobs is, for one, being that retained jobs can either mean different things to different companies. Retained jobs may mean those are the continued jobs that are still at this facility despite a transition, or they may be retained in terms of being at risk of losing those jobs, and they were decided to be saved for that particular investment. So we focus here just on those new jobs, and we still see that huge uptick in jobs tied to the new investments. So again, year on the vertical axis and number of jobs on the horizontal axis, we still see that proportion of jobs going toward electrification is increasing as well. And so if we continue to the next slide, we'll see what this pattern looks like in Michigan. So very similar pattern here. Most of these new jobs in Michigan from 2021 forward really were tied to electrification, an even greater proportion within the state of Michigan. We don't show data on jobs here in 2025 of late, but we expect to see very similar patterns as the North America trends. And if we go to the next slide here, I want to take a moment to focus also on the supplier investments. So just a note too, we always want to make sure we're capturing as much of these investments as we can. Oftentimes, because they are based on public announcements, it doesn't necessarily include a lot of the small and medium-sized manufacturers and suppliers that we have represented in the industry. So many of these are our larger suppliers. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that that pattern of North American investments from the same time period, so 2009 through first quarter this year, we still see a very, very similar sawtooth pattern with that recent uptick. Typically, what we observe between the automakers and suppliers is a little bit of a lag. So understandably, the automakers will announce shifts, and those programs and agreements come to follow with the suppliers. So we'll see that uptick that comes slightly later. So we see that those big peaks that are happening more in 2022 and onwards. We also still see that pattern of having a larger proportion of investments being tied to electrification here. Um, and some of the things that we see are still a good proportion of those investments being tied to traditional, what we call non-EV in on the graph here, but primarily internal combustion engine related investments. And that's still important for the market, right? So here we see that roughly about 49% of the investments in the more recent period are tied to electrification relative to the 80% or so that we see in automakers. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see a similar pattern in Michigan. So we see, again, the big uptick around 2022. We see that, actually the proportion of the electrification investments is much higher in Michigan relative to North America overall. That's not surprising given that Michigan is very in tune with these industry shifts, probably even more because it's happening and, all around us, and these communities and the companies that are making the big shifts are announcing that it's very much on everyone's radar. So I think what happens is this starts to take hold in Michigan and starts to spread across the country slowly, which isn't necessarily represented here visually, but I think when we see that higher proportion of electrification investments, we see that greater focus on electrification within the state. And so when we see that distribution of investments, it's very similar. We see a lot more on the supplier side going to the West Coast. A lot of that has to do with the battery manufacturing that starts to happen more on the West Coast. We see that states like California, Arizona, and Nevada are increasing their investments in this area. Again, Michigan is in the lead here with investments at around 11% of the entire supplier market share. There are also states in the Southeast, such as South Carolina, that are starting to make investments, such as Redwood Materials in battery materials manufacturing, and some of the investments related to batteries alone, so packs, cathode and anode materials. So if we go to the next slide, I want to focus, given that we're looking at time here, I want to focus on some of those jobs tied to supplier investments too. So we see a very similar pattern here. Importantly, we see a lot of those new jobs being tied to electrification. And again, these are new jobs. So great deal of new jobs entering the market, being a part of, in this case, the US market. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that pattern for Michigan. The scale of these investments and the types of jobs that they're bringing really are having a significant impact on our communities. And I think that's really a big takeaway here, is that we're thinking about those job shifts that are happening. And so when we think about those 11 communities in the MiVTTP program being seated in the heart of Michigan, I think we want to think about the implications of these investments and the changes in jobs that are happening. So I have a few slides dedicated to looking at some of these investments by the region. And rather than looking at them by the city and breaking that down, we looked at it by county. So if we go to the next couple of slides here, we'll step through. We see this broken out by the counties that are surrounding these 11 communities. And what I want to show here is really the scale of these investments that are starting to increase, as well as the jobs associated with these areas. Most of these investments, we see investment toward electrification is outsizing the ICE-related investments across both automakers and suppliers. So the data that you see here are combined investments among automakers and suppliers. And we see the combined new jobs that are shaking out for ICE versus EV. So examples of that from Eaton County and Ingham, in the Lansing area, we see investments tied to both ICE and EV with projected new jobs, some tied to Grand River Assembly, the GM facility building for EVs. We also see the investments tied to Delta Assembly Plant investments for two different models. In the Flint, Genesee area, we have investments at GM and two different companies, Nanograph and Plastic Omnium. So these are new facilities for hydrogen storage and battery materials. So looking at new technologies, we see this diversification amongst companies across this entire region. So it's exciting to see these developing, and there is a diversification between the traditional internal combustion engine manufacturers and the ones that are moving into more of the EV and battery related manufacturing. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to acknowledge too that much of what we've been focusing on are the new jobs and everything that's to come. We certainly want to take into account that there are updates to these jobs that happen as a function of all the uncertainty that we're observing. And this here is one example of one way we might be able to capture that. So some of these updates to jobs have to do with delayed investment timelines and sometimes shutdowns, facilities, or layoffs. If we take the worker adjustment and retraining notifications or the WARN notices as an example of that, this is when announcements are made and they're required by federal law to be made for companies that have more than 100 employees. We see that there are the jobs that we're talking about are represented in the first two columns in terms of job changes, whether those are layoffs or downsizing related to facility closing. Many of these are not company closures, but facility closures, nonetheless having a significant impact on the communities that are really part of every day here. So many of these are a reflection of the changing strategies and impact on the auto industry and the people in our great community. So if we move into the next slide, I wanted to break this out by the types of investments we're seeing. So on the flip side, when we're talking about that growth, we do see a great distribution of the expansions, the new facilities, the retooling that are happening in all of these counties. And so when we talk about each of these counties, are recognized where the 11 cities are located, and the Oakland County, we only looked at the Pontiac area alone. So this is a count of investments by type for each area. And this is automakers alone. On the next slide, we see a very similar pattern for the suppliers, and we see that diversification across both ICE and EV related investments. And they're meaning that we're still seeing a base for jobs traditionally associated with internal combustion engines, but it means that some of these companies going forward may be in a position where they need to think about a transition as electric vehicles have a greater representation across the market. And so in the next slide, I wanted to just touch on sales, and just for a moment want to check in on time with everyone. As we are, I want to make sure we reserve some time. I have maybe 5 or 6 more minutes of content, and then we could jump over to questions. Does that work?
Yes, that sounds great.
All right. So I think when we are focusing in on investments, much of this is collapsing across electrification broadly. And it really doesn't dig down into the story that we're actually seeing play out in the industry, which is important to acknowledge that when we talk about electrification, it isn't all just battery electric vehicles, so traditional EV. We know we have a diverse offering of different types of vehicle propulsion systems right now, and our consumers have a lot of options, and we're seeing that play out in the market. So I wanted to share a little bit in terms of sales updates that really reflect what is happening in the US and how things are moving forward. So if we go to the next slide, I want to show part of that story in the US. So what you see on the left-hand side has to do with the market share. First in dark blue are the different types of vehicle platform. So we're talking about crossover utility vehicles leading the market in terms of the different types of segments. And what you see in the green is the market share for electrified vehicles. So that's all battery electric, plug-in hybrids, traditional hybrid electric vehicles, as well as fuel cell electric vehicles. So they're taking about 19% of that US light vehicle market. So the light duty vehicles, meaning the passenger vehicles and light duty commercial. 19% is a relatively, optimistic and strong market share when we think about all of those vehicle types together. If we break it out on the right-hand side, we look at that pie chart, we see about half of that is for the hybrid electric vehicle. So it's not really being led by battery electric vehicles alone. That's about 40% of that 19%, and a smaller share for plug-in hybrid. And fuel cell vehicles are really standing around 0 to 2% of that total market share. And these are data through the end of 2024 or Q3 of 2024. I think it'd be interesting for us to look at some of the 2025 data as we start to get that together and see how that starts to shake out. But when we look at the timeline on the next slide, we see that we see this trajectory. So this is amongst the hybrid electric plugins and battery electric vehicles. We see that this is starting to increase in terms of overall market share. So total market share, as I mentioned, about 19% in 2024. This breaks out to a larger proportion of those hybrids, so almost 10%. As of last year, with that smaller share of plug-in hybrids and then the battery electric. So we see that trajectory. It's really the increase of hybrid vehicles that are starting to, are really driving the demand here. And I think that speaks to what our consumers are comfortable doing in this transition. We go to the next slide. I wanted to also point out the month-to-month sales. So we look at this year over year and month over month. We're seeing that in the first quarter of this year, we've seen a very similar pattern of sales, but that there was a big peak in this first quarter, and we expect that that has a lot to do with the fact that people are trying to get ahead of making a vehicle purchase before we see tariffs being enacted, before we see the consumer credit that was proposed to be dissolved, which is now in fact dissolved. So we saw that the consumers are trying to make a move toward more purchasing. And some of that is driven by some of the incentives that the automakers have been offering too. And we'll go next to this slide. I want to make sure we allow for a little time on policy. So as the title of today's webinar suggests, I think the question is, who is driving? So if we go to the next slide, I want to give you a little primer on some of the big policies that are on the radar for automotive. Policy in automotive is certainly center stage right now. Policy has always had a huge impact on the auto industry decision making. We know that our automakers and suppliers have been anticipating some of these shifts. We've experienced a great deal of shift related to the prior administration and the White House. Instituting a great deal of incentives around electric vehicles and manufacturing. Now we're seeing a big shift back with the new administration to not only go the other direction per se, but also thinking a little bit more about onshoring manufacturing and having a focus with tariffs to try to even heighten that. And I think the main difference we're seeing here is the timeline of some of these policy enactments, the announcements that are creating a great deal of uncertainty. So first of which I wanted to point out is the USMCA. This is the recent legislation that was enacted. We know that started in 2018, took effect in 2020, is also set to be reviewed next year in 2026. So the USMCA, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Those letters are shifted around depending on where you live. And this is the policy that requires now 75% of vehicle components to be made in North America and 40 to 45% of auto content be produced by workers that are earning at least $16 an hour to be eligible for tariff-free trade. So this is a summary of the policy here. There's much more to the story, but the U.S. International Trade Commission recently had a report that came out. It's a great resource if you're interested in diving into the USMCA more deeply. They talk a lot about the rules of origin and that impact on US parts production, as well as the macroeconomic impact. The stricter rules that were enacted of late increase that what we call regional value content and vehicle content to think about these different rules of origin. So increasing it from 62% to 75%, and then increasing the labor content here, the labor value content, to have that higher wage value. And that's intended to boost not only the manufacturing in the region, but as well as increase the quality of these jobs. On the right-hand side, I want to point out the One Big Beautiful Bill. This is the most recently enacted legislation that was signed into law on July 4th. There's several items here that are relevant for automotive. I think many are focused on the EV consumer credit changes. There are a couple of things here that have been included. So one being the auto loan interest deduction added for new models here. So that's model year 2025 through 2028. That means that up to $10,000 a year could be deducted on interest paid for passenger vehicle loan. There's also increased manufacturing incentives having to do with 100% bonus depreciation for first full year depreciation on qualifying property. So that's designed to impact manufacturing equipment and facilities. And as I mentioned, the EV consumer credit. The intention of many of these is to also boost that domestic manufacturing and assembly, also to diversify vehicle options for consumers and roll back some of the pressure on automakers in terms of emission regulation. And we'll step through the tariff update. I wanted to look at the next slide briefly, and then we could shift over to questions. Some of this we know is very much a moving target. So you'll see this timeline that I'm showing you here has really just been all the activity that's taken place between March and July. So we have been observing these tariff announcements at CAR. I think many of us are watching this daily in the news as it's taking its course. CAR recently conducted some work on examining the impact of tariffs on the industry at, the impact on the D3 as well as the US industry and what those costs may look like. Interestingly enough, though, all of those data are always changing. So those numbers are really changing as a function of the announcements and the negotiations that are happening between the US and other countries right now. So all of this began with the initial 25% tariff announcement on all imported goods. This was to take effect in April for vehicles and then followed by some of the additional updates on stacking relief. So this has to do with the tariffs on autos and parts won't stack with the additional duties that we see associated with existing steel and aluminum duties for Canada-Mexico tariffs. And there's an offset credit that was introduced for domestic assembly. So that's set to be around 3.75% this year and reducing over the next 2 years. Some of those announcements have been revised and paused in terms of those enactments, and now we are at a deadline that's extended through August 1st. So we'll be watching to see what develops around that time. Some of the outcomes that we've observed related to these tariffs have had to do with shifting production to the US. So taking additional capacity we might have here in our plants and moving some of the facility or productions that's been offshored back to the US and North America. So we've seen GM announcing some of those things, some things related to scaling back EV lineups, such as those that have been announced by Volvo. And then just in the news of recently, GM was noting some of their net losses related to the changes in tariffs. Stellantis also reported some of those costs associated with tariffs for the first half of the year. And I expect that we'll see some more of those announcements coming out in terms of the financial impact on the automakers. So I'm going to pause here. I want to make sure we still have time for questions and happy to dive back into some of the findings that we had specific to communities. So I'll say thanks and we'll go to the next slide and we'll make sure we have time for questions.
Wow, Lisa, thank you so much for this compelling presentation. There are, as we know, but there are so many elements to this transition. And yeah, we're here because folks have questions, and you have really brought to light many of the things happening in the industry and in policy. And I think those have been what most folks have been wondering about. So we have some opportunity for folks to ask questions. If you'd like, you can come off mute to ask your question that way, or you can enter your question into the chat. We have time for probably 2 or 3 questions or so, and we can work to get those distributed. So I'll first make space in case there are some questions, and if not, I have a few. So I do have one for you while we think.
Fire away.
All right. So you mentioned earlier on in that industry that there has been some Michigan investment on the industry level regarding EVs, but it seemed to me that there was also some direction headed, like you mentioned, toward headed west. I'm curious if you think that Michigan trend will hang steady, or do you predict that there will be continued kind of migration towards non-Michigan states?
Good
Uh,
question. And I think when we see that, our first thought here is, oh, it's diversifying across the country. Is Michigan to lose its hold on traditional automotive manufacturing? And I would say because this market has really diversified in terms of technology shifts, especially with EVs, we see battery manufacturing is been such a big part of those electrification investments. Some of those are joint ventures between automakers and battery manufacturers. Some of those are battery manufacturers and standalone. Some are new companies that are cropping up as a function of need and improving upon the battery chemistry and some of those features related to range. I think what we're seeing across the country reflects that increasing connection between automotive and what we didn't traditionally consider to be part of the automotive industry. So batteries being one example of that. Another example might be chips. Our vehicles have at least 100 chips in them to be able to, enact multiple functions. There are more and more electronic needs and features in the vehicle than ever. We're moving toward a more software dedicated architecture in our vehicles. So the electronics and all of the insides are changing. And so some of that is making automotive really touch a lot of these other types of industries. It's muddying some of those lines. And I think that's where we're seeing some of that shift across the country, is that where some of those industries, such as semiconductors and some of the battery manufacturing and new electric vehicle companies are more seated out on the West Coast. I don't think that it means we're necessarily losing a hold, but I think it's reflecting that diversification. And nonetheless, I think that it's always a competitive market in the US. I think that Michigan has a great deal of strengths to focus on, but it's also a time I think that we can best use to reflect on our market and our capabilities here in the state and see how we can transition as these technologies continue to develop.
mhm. Hmm. Thanks for that insight. It seems as if from what you're sharing that there's more to come, and it will be crucial for us just to also be thinking about how to prepare our communities well and our workforce well, so that we're in good position to take advantage of opportunities as they become available. Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for another question or two. So if you do have that, feel free to put it in the chat. Um, Yes. Okay. We have one here from Jeffrey. There was some rumbling from politicians about renegotiating USMCA. Has there been any action taken, as far as you're aware, to actually move on renegotiating it?
My understanding is that we're still on par to do that for 2026. And I know that of late, that's probably lost some attention in the media, in regards to what we're seeing in tariffs. But my understanding is that is continuing to be on track. Now, we'll have to see. Every day we have a new announcement, and with our current administration, I think if anything, we can be certain that there is going to be change ahead of us. So stay tuned on that. I wish I had a crystal ball and could say, we know for sure if they're going to be, different announcements or if things will stay on track. I think if anything, the change is set to be what to expect.
Thank you. I'm going to read out Chris's question, which I think reflects many people's concern in part. So, how does the political ping-ponging affect American OEMs' competitiveness globally? With the comment that China continues to make inroads serving global markets that are already further along in this transition.
Great point. I think that's one that is probably more on everyone's mind now when we look at what China has been doing. So, first of which, yes, I think we could say that there is a ping pong effect. So, when we see changes in policy associated with new administration, it feels very much like we go from one end of a priority to another. And many of these policies right now are not just enacting something new, but they're reversing that same policy a few years later. And that does create a great deal of uncertainty in terms of decision making. That said, I think when we zoom out to the globe and we look at the entirety of the EV market and where things are headed, one, a lot of the investments that toward electric vehicles are moving along. And I think rather than thinking of it as one step forward, one step back, or this is on and this is off, is that it really is more about when some of these things are set to take hold. So the investments that are happening in the US, many of those are shifting in terms of some of their timelines, in terms of expectations and targets. However, many of those are staying true. They're still here, and those are large scale investments. If we think about those happening over the course of decades. So that's looking ahead in terms of what this trajectory is going to be within the auto industry. And so much of that is going to withstand the day to day and the year to year changes in policy because this is a general shift that is taking place. It's really about the pace that's happening in the US. The issue around China has to do with the fact that China did subsidize so much of its battery manufacturing and vehicle technology development for many years. They focus much more on R&D and bringing EVs to scale and making them much more affordable for consumers for a good deal of time, and really leapfrogged ahead of the US and a lot of markets across the globe. And so that's having a huge impact on how automakers in North America and everywhere else are thinking about how to get EVs costs down. And a lot of that has to do with the battery cost, and that is starting to come down. But if we're not building to scale, or if that demand isn't there, then what is happening in North America is that we're seeing that diversification of manufacturing across propulsion types that have to do with subsidizing those developments and bringing EVs to scale and bringing them online at the time where they match demand, along with continuing to manufacture internal combustion engines and hybrid electric vehicles that are more affordable to manufacture and are also slightly more affordable for consumers right now.
Mm, yes. And I think these seem to be questions. Wow. Thank you so much that it seems like we'll just need to also be monitoring in the coming months and even the year to see what occurs here. So thank you for that insight. And I think, yeah, we'll probably all be asking that question for a little while longer. We have time for one more question before we look ahead to next steps, and we'll get to hear what y'all are up to and how we can be in support to you, Lisa. Chris has asked a two-parter. We'll see if what we can address here, but I'll read it out for us. With the elimination of the $7,500 incentive in September, the revenue losses from the OEMs, do you have the job performance numbers for the second quarter? And or are you tracking the battery needs and the money that will be available through the Department of Defense?
Yeah, great questions. So much is happening. So of late for all of you, I mentioned the one big beautiful bill, the mouthful to say.
Still
So
in this meeting, Ma.
OBBB, the consumer credit for $7,500 for both new EVs and used EVs was eliminated. And so we anticipate that incentive is going to impact consumer decision making and buying. What we are starting to see, and I didn't show in these slides, are some of the forecasts that are starting to say that some of those trajectories in terms of the market share and demand for EVs are starting to go down. And we're going to start seeing a lot of that here at the end of the second quarter as those data start to emerge. And we are starting to see those reports by our OEMs about revenue loss. This will certainly be enacted. I anticipate the impact on jobs is probably going to play out in the next probably 6 months or so, where we start to see first the announcements related to costs and then what those strategies are to be able to combat costs. Where we unfortunately see that play out is in terms of employment, but we don't yet have indicators of that job performance change. I think right now for Book of Deals data, I didn't quite show what we had as much in terms of Q1 and Q2 for jobs. I would say some of that isn't going to be quite as sensitive, but where you would see those changes in jobs would be from Bureau of Labor Statistics and some of the trajectories around shifting jobs and the layoffs that are announced in the coming months related to some of that onshoring or reshoring or even shifting around of different models and timelines there. Related to that second question in terms of battery needs and money available through the DoD, that's not something that CAR typically looks at in terms of defense. However, we know that in terms of battery need, if we're thinking about battery demand, we're certainly looking at battery demand as a function of vehicle production and sales forecast. So we anticipate the battery needs to continue to go up and track with the vehicle demand. I think that again, we will see some revision to some of those forecasts and anticipate that will change. Um, the the funding, when we talk about how that shakes out in terms of planning, I do think that defense tends to be the first place where we see changes in terms of vehicle and technology development. And that will be continued to be likely to be prioritized within this administration. And we may see that there be some shifts there. We also anticipate seeing some shifts related to the CHIPS Act or repackaging of that policy in terms of keeping up with global competitiveness and the need for national security. So I would say stay tuned on that a little bit more. And, we hope to have some more to share on that in the future.
Yeah, right on. Thank you so much. We are close to time, so we're just going to do some wrapping up here to talk about some resources. So Lisa has some wonderful things to invite us to and share with us, and so we will make sure to include those visuals in your your newsletter, where we thank you for your participation here. But briefly, you'll see that there's some upcoming events, one just on Thursday in Midland, and then one, the Management Briefing Seminar in September at Detroit Central Station. Will be very important. Overall, we are committed to equity, and we're thinking about how these things affect the community in Michigan. And so, Lisa, we are so grateful for your time and how you've outlined that for us. If you have further questions about really anything related to this transition, we would love to be able to be in support. And MiTalks is designed to answer those hot topics and the burning questions that you have about this transition in the state of Michigan. So please do keep in touch if you have additional questions or suggestions for forthcoming topics. We'd love to work with you if you have ideas or suggestions that we can talk to experts about. Thank you so much for your participation, everyone. This will be recorded and available on YouTube after this, so you can share this out with your networks if you have any more information you'd like to share. Thank you very much. Please have a good rest of your day. And thank you again, Lisa, for your participation here
Thank
and
you
your
all.
leadership.
Right. Take care.